if I handed you two technologies in the year 1400, in the year 1200, long before either of these technologies existed, and I said, I could give you this giant device that would allow you to print paper books, or I'll give you this device called the internet, where you can do the same thing, but deliver that content globally in a fraction of a second, you'd say, well, why would I take the printing press when I could take this thing that does the same thing and delivers that content to anyone in the globe in a fraction of a second?
That was Chris Martin. I'm Adsum Ravenhill, and you're listening to the Consider the Ravens podcast. Thank you so much for being with us today. Today we are talking about social media, or as Chris calls it, the social internet. We believe that literature bolsters discipleship in the local church, but with information being harvested and consumed mostly online nowadays, how do we view that, and how do we work out how to discern and treat this information wisely? Chris Martin has written on social media extensively through his newsletter and his new book, Terms of Service. Without further ado.
I've been writing on the internet since I was in 8th grade, unfortunately, but I've been doing a good bit of writing for a long time, and lately, in the last 5 years or so, I've started to really turn toward focusing on the social internet and how our current iteration of the internet, which is often called Web 2.0, affects us maybe in ways we don't often realize. And I'm a Christian, and I write from a Christian worldview, and I think that's pretty clear. But I want to do everything I can to write in such a way that it would be helpful to Christians or non-Christians alike. And sometimes I'll write things that are more specifically for believers, and it's like, hey, let's have a little family talk here kind of discussion where we need to talk specifically about how our faith is impacted by the social internet and our relationship with it. But a lot of times, like I think much of what I wrote in Terms of Service, the book, which is also the name of my newsletter, but what I wrote in the book, which comes out in February of 22, is applicable to people whether or not they would believe in Jesus Christ and trust in him for salvation. Because I think it's just affecting us in so many social ways and psychological ways. And I have no credentials to be like diagnosing people with psychological disorders or anything like that. But I am, if I can toot my own horn a little bit, I'm pretty good at like reading and synthesizing information and writing from people who are qualified to write about such things. And I've done a lot of time doing that. I spent a lot of time doing that. And much of what I write is not, there are plenty of people who write good theology of social media kind of content who are very interested in talking about here's what scripture says about how we should engage on social media. And I think that's very valuable. And there are a handful of people who do that well. And I do that a little bit, but much of what I'm writing, both in the newsletter and in the book, are more kind of broad, I suppose you could say, of let's just stop scrolling for a second and zoom out from our lives. If we could kind of go third person mode in our lives for a second and look over our own shoulders and watch us move about our days, what would we observe that scrolling constantly is doing to us? There is reason to be concerned with what we are consuming, but what I'm as interested in is what consuming is doing to us. I don't get caught up in a lot of conversations about, oh, well, what about, like, we shouldn't be watching these videos or we shouldn't be reading this content, though, again, those are some worthy discussions. I'm as interested in kind of the general movement of what is this consumption of content at all times doing to us as people? What is the mass collection of user data doing? What are the implications of that on us? So I'm really just trying to look at big picture questions and things like that. So
that's so true. And I think, with the common phrase of you are what you eat, like it's so much more than just eating it. We are really consuming a lot of what we're seeing and scrolling. I love how you are obviously really passionate about this. What made you start this journey of realizing how important it is?
Yeah. Given that I've been on the internet for a long time, longer than most people my age have been. Like my dad worked for IBM, which if you don't know what IBM, I mean, it's a huge global computer company. He worked for IBM from home most of my life, my young life. Like in 1993, he was working from home. In fact, a local newspaper like did a story on the fact that he was working from home because it was like amazing that he could work from home in 1993. And because it was definitely revolutionary then. No Zoom back then. They were amazed that he had two phone lines in his house, one for work and one for the family. But like, so I was on the computer and tinkering with the internet in like 1995. You know, I was 5 years old, 4 or 5 years old. And so I was like learning that kind of thing. So I've always just been really, when I was in high school, I wrote for the school paper, and like I had a tech column, and like I was writing a lot. Like I remember creating my Twitter account in my high school journalism class when I was a junior in high school. And so like I've just always really been interested in this stuff. I used to want to go work for like Google, Facebook. Like when I was in high school, I wanted to do computer science and go out and work for one of those big companies. And I eventually didn't, for some good reasons, I think. But then really, to kind of where we are today, to fast forward, a few years ago, I read Amusing Ourselves to Death for the first time. I want to say it was 2016. And that's a book by Neil Postman written in 1985. He was a media professor at New York University, died in 2003, right around the turn of the millennium. And in Amusing Ourselves to Death, without summarizing the whole book, really what Postman is saying is that we are amusing ourselves to death. And he focuses a lot on the revolutionary invention of the television, because in 1985, that's what was revolutionizing things. And when I read that book for the first time a few years ago, 5 or 6 years ago now, I was amazed by how relevant it was to today, and how I think it's even more relevant today than it was then. And perhaps the most striking image in that book is where he says, you know, all of us are, he kind of teases this in the intro, and then I think he has a whole chapter on it toward the end. Many of us are very concerned about an Orwellian future, a 1984 future where the government oppresses us by putting televisions in our home with cameras on them and makes us watch propaganda every night at 7:00 or whatever, you know, and we have this idea that the government is going to oppress us through technology. And that's one view of a dystopian future. Again, I'm not dismissing that, but I think that is a little less on the fore and a little less realistic than Aldous Huxley's vision of a dystopian future in Brave New World.
I love
and
that
this
book.
This is what Postman is kind of contrasting the two. He basically says, in paraphrasing him, everyone's concerned about an Orwellian dystopian future, but he was like, I think we're honestly much closer to a Huxleyan dystopian future where it's not what we hate that will be our demise, that would be Orwell, but it's what we love that will be our demise, which that's Huxley. And so we are going to amuse ourselves to death. I think it's this sort of modern psychological hedonism where it's just like, we're never going to be fed, and our fancies and our pleasures and our feelings of good feelings are never going to be satiated enough. And I fear that's what we're headed towards. So anyway, that's really what set me on this path in the last 4 or 5 years of focusing a lot of my writing in this space. And I kind of thought, not to say that I think I am this person, but when I read Amusing Ourselves to Death, I said, it'd be really cool if we had a 21st century Neil Postman writing from a Christian perspective. And when I thought it'd be really cool for that kind of person to exist, I was like, well, why can't I try to be like that? And that's like, if I would describe what I try to do in a sentence, it's I'm trying to be a 21st century Neil Postman from a Christian perspective. So anyway, that's a little bit of where I'm at and why I'm doing what I'm doing here.
Definitely. I mean, so you've said in the past that Facebook or social media is the most consequential innovation or technology in history. And I think a lot of that has come through in the things that you've been saying. But I think a lot of people who are aware of things like Postman's work and other innovations that have happened through history, maybe the printing press and things like that, would kind of go, Well, no. It's not. It's not as important as those things. It's not as consequential as those things. What makes you say, actually, this is almost where I'm placing my stake in the ground? This is the thing that I think is the most important thing. What? Yeah. Where would you go with that?
Yeah, and that's that is a pretty stark statement that I make, and I stand behind it. And I'll explain why. So I think it would be foolish to say that the social internet or the internet in general is like stands alone as the most important innovation in human history, because obviously you needed other technologies for the internet to happen, right? So like the harnessing, we didn't invent electricity, it's a naturally occurring phenomenon, but like the harnessing of electricity is a necessary invention for the internet. So in some ways, like, the harnessing of electricity is really the most if you're going to say the internet's the most important, well, really the harnessing of electricity is really the most important invention. Okay, yeah, granted, like there are certain foundational technologies, and I would say the same with the printing press. A lot of people when I have this conversation are like, well, the printing press, like Protestant Reformation. I'm like, oh, buddy, if you think the Protestant Reformation is like the biggest social, like global event to have happened in human history because of technology, or that will happen in human history because of technology, like, look, I'm sitting here as an American evangelical in the 21st century, and I'm grateful for the Protestant Reformation. But like, frankly, I think the internet has already caused some events that could rival that, and certainly will lead to events that will make the Protestant Reformation seem like small potatoes in the future. And like I write in the book, and this is another kind of shocking statement, like the internet will be central to whatever the next major global conflict is that could lead to the demise of our species. Like it will be central in that, in whatever that means, in World War III or however you view that, like something like that, some global conflict is eventually going to happen. And the internet will be central in that, I think. And so like, anyway, I think the printing press is hugely important. I'm obviously grateful for it. Here's why the internet, to put a point on it, here's why the internet's more important or more impactful than the printing press. It does everything the printing press does, but delivers the materials of the printing press at light speed. And I mean, I'm not using that figuratively. Like fiber optic cables it's doing the printing press. It's doing everything the printing press did. Like the printing press and the internet, you can create content in the same exact way. But the printing press, disseminating what was printed on the printing press was actually quite difficult. And to this day, it's quite difficult. It's much easier to deliver an ebook than it is to deliver a physical book, much cheaper. Not saying that like ebooks are better. That's not what I'm trying to say, but I'm just saying, like, if you're looking at, if I handed you two technologies in the year 1400, in the year 1200, long before either of these technologies existed, and I said, I could give you this giant device that would allow you to print paper books, or I'll give you this device called the internet, where you can do the same thing, but deliver that content globally in a fraction of a second, you'd say, well, why would I take the printing press when I could take this thing that does the same thing and delivers that content to anyone in the globe in a fraction of a second? That's why I really don't think there's much competition. And I think the internet's just so young that we have yet to see the Protestant Reformation moment that maybe, people often say, well, the printing press led to the Protestant Reformation. Well, yeah, that's true. But I think the internet will lead to far more consequential global events, some of which could be really good, and I think some of which will certainly not be really good. I mean, Twitter itself, one of the least influential social media platforms. A lot of people don't like to think that, but like 20% of Americans are on Twitter. Like, it's not that influential. It led to the overthrow of like Egypt, like the Arab Spring was initiated via Twitter. Like Twitter was a major factor in the Arab Spring from a number of years ago. And so I think we should understand that the internet is much more, in the social internet and the future of the internet and Web3 is much more consequential than really any individual technology we've seen.
And I think so. There's a big difference between the way that you've talked about the printing press and how history has talked about those things, where actually you could give the printing press into somebody's hands that would then use that for a certain end, but it wasn't made like inbuilt with the Protestant Revolution or the Protestant Reformation. Sorry, so it's like actually it's not in its programming, but you've said on the one hand that Facebook has routinely made decisions and mistakes that just happen to serve its customers, its advertisers, to the detriment of its users. But also, again, quite a controversial and kind of hard-hitting statement. You said Facebook or social media is broken at its core because it's made by people who are broken at their core. Can you go into that a bit? Kind of how does our fallen nature affect how we've made social media and then how we go on to use it?
Yeah, one of the more foolish things I hear said about social media and the social internet, which I only say that because I once believed this, so I'm not trying to call anybody out. I once thought this way until just the last couple of years, is the social internet is a neutral tool. I think when someone says that, all I hear is I don't understand how the internet works, and that might sound mean, but like surely like that. If you think the social internet is neutral, like the only things in life in the world that are neutral tools are things that we would like discover in nature that we've never had a hand in creating. And even that, because nature itself is fallen, I would argue maybe aren't neutral tools. But like fire is a neutral tool, right? Like you can use fire to cook food. You can use fire to destroy a house. Fire is not, there's nothing baked into the technology of fire, if you will, that lends it more toward destruction or creation. There's not this bent toward destruction or this bent toward building up. It could really kind of equally be used for good or for ill, just depending on who uses it. We did not discover the social internet like we discovered fire. We did not discover the social internet as some like naturally occurring resource in a cave somewhere and be like, whoa, look at this thing we found. It can be used for good or it can be used for evil. The social internet was created by sinful human beings looking to make money and connect the world at the same time. And to believe that the internet is social and that the social internet is neutral is to totally ignore the incentives at the core of the social internet. So like just a couple of examples. One about how we use it and one about how the platform, how a particular platform is oriented. So, and they kind of relate. So Facebook is not, let's take Facebook as an example because they're the easiest one. They're the most popular social media platform in the world. And they're the easiest example for this. So the Facebook newsfeed is not chronological. It's loosely chronological in that you're more likely to see something that was posted yesterday than a month ago. But it's not like, the earliest Twitter feed, which was hard chronological. You see the most recent tweet, the second most recent tweet, the third most recent tweet. You don't, that's not how Facebook works. Facebook is a feed that's curated by Facebook based on a number of factors, and it's undergirded by an algorithm or multiple algorithms, which are just mathematical equations that take countless variables into effect and deliver you content in your feed that Facebook believes you will find interesting. So Facebook's goal is to make money, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that's bad, but like that's Facebook's goal, is to make money. The way they make money is by keeping people on their platform and selling ads. And the way they sell the most ads at the highest rates is by keeping as many people on their platform for as long as they possibly can. If nobody used Facebook, or if people used Facebook for 5 minutes a week, their ads would have to be a lot cheaper because advertisers would not find it worthy to pay a dollar per click or whatever, so Facebook is incentivized to do whatever it has to do to keep you and I on the platform as long as possible. That's how their business works. Facebook is not incentivized for civic public discourse, because that does not lead. But here's the thing. Unfortunately, if civic public discourse led to more revenue, they would be doing that. They would do everything they can to make that happen. But human nature, our sinful human nature, when we get on Facebook, I'm talking in mass, what keeps us on Facebook is conflict, not civic public discourse. And Facebook recognizes that. And they say a lot of more engagement comes around conflict than any other kind of interaction. So we're going to, in that algorithm, in that feed where Facebook is deciding what to float to the top, we're going to float to the top the content that has the most engagement. If you ask any marketer, what's the most important metric on social media? Followers, engagement, whatever, reach. Engagement is number one. Engagement is the most strong indicator of interest and buying power and all that. So Facebook is going to float to the top of your news feed the content that has the most engagement, generally speaking. And most often, the content that has the most engagement is content that is antagonistic in nature. And Facebook does this because they know that that's how you're more likely to stay on the platform. And that's how they continue to make the most money. So it's not like, what I'm saying is, people often complain about Facebook or Twitter, any of these platforms, and say, well, people just like to go on there and fight. And I agree that we are to blame in part, but we're not, we have help. Like, it's like there are 4 different roads you can walk when you get on Facebook. You can like go be entertained, or you can go be encouraged, or you can go have a deep conversation, or you can go fight. And it's like Facebook has lined the road to go fight with gold and dropped some candy along and said, hey, come this way. Isn't this way much more fun and interesting? Like, the platform is slanted toward conflict because it helps with revenue. And the Facebook papers that were released in October of 2021 really bring this to the fore. And a lot of people like me for a long time said, I think Facebook is incentivizing conflict. Like, I really think they're incentivizing conflict, but we really had no evidence of that. And the Facebook papers just blew those doors wide open and made it very clear that they've been incentivizing conflict and discord for some time in order to make as much revenue as possible. So after hearing all of that, like, if you understand how that platforms are incentivized to rank content for the sake of revenue rather than for the sake of neutrality in public discourse, it becomes very difficult to see social media as a neutral tool. And when you look at people fighting on Facebook or wherever, I start to have a little bit more compassion for them, because in my view, they just got duped by their feeds. They didn't necessarily come looking for a fight. They were kind of baited, likely, into wanting to fight in whatever comment section they're fighting in.
So it's almost like if you've got like a bar or something, and then out the back there's like an arcade, but it's really kind of shoddy and not really well built, and you've got to pay for it. And then there's a quiet area, but it's not that quiet, so you could go and have a conversation there. But right out front you've got a boxing ring, and if you're willing to step into the boxing ring, then you'll get free drinks all night or something like that. And then people are walking in going, that's what this is for, so I'll go in and I'll watch that, and I'm coming in order to engage in or watch or enjoy or comment on. And there are these other things, and Facebook can go, well, we've got other things on offer, or Twitter can say we've got other things on offer, but really what we're about is this thing. Like, you can come
and it's fight. Like, that's right. And it's like the bar makes money based on how long people stay around.
Yeah.
And they've realized, people stick around longer if they're attending the boxing match or even participating in the boxing match. So we're going to kind of do whatever we can to, we offer these other things, but we're going to go point them toward the boxing match, because the longer they stay, the more money we make. So, that's like, I think, and that's so much of a lot of my writing is simply just trying to educate people on this stuff. Because I think if you come to social media, the social internet, and say it's a neutral platform, it's not like I think you're willfully wrong. I think you maybe just don't understand the entire conversation we just had. I think a lot of people just don't get that these platforms incentivize different kinds of content and incentivize different kinds of action, most of which are not positive in nature. And that, I think, it's not a blank slate. That I think the finger is on the scale toward conflict and discord rather than encouragement and building one another up.
And I think anecdotally as well, I know when I go on Facebook, like the first thing that comes up is always news articles of like this political thing or that political thing. Sure. And I think probably especially with lockdown, your book is probably just so important because people haven't been talking so much. They've just been more on social media, and there's just so much more division with politics and all these other stuff that we're not going to mention because it might get controversial.
No, let's be controversial because that will do well on social media.
Yeah, that's true.
So what can you give us that's controversial so that we can really rise to the ranks?
But yeah, no. So I think definitely that's a really good perspective to have, knowing that it's not neutral, and actually it will affect our day-to-day lives when we're off social media. It means that we've had such a tunnel view that we'll talk to other people and be shocked that people have different opinions to us. And you see what I mean? And I've seen that in my own life, where people have just been so stuck that they've said something else, and they've been so shocked when other people have had
disagreements, especially after being in an echo chamber for so long and just assuming everyone else agrees with them because this is all anyone's sharing.
Yeah.
With that said, we've painted quite a grim picture of the social internet, of Facebook and these other social media platforms, but you are writing a book about, or have written a book about this that's coming out. Presumably there's some real positives that we can gain from this, kind of to kind of summarize the whole negative kind of picture that we've been painting. You spoke to pastors a while back saying, look, you've done your sermon, it's beautiful, you've preached on 1 John, and people have been led to love Jesus and they're praying about it, and praise God for that on the Sunday, but for the other 6 days of the week, they're not bowing their heads in devotion to the Lord. They're bowing their heads in devotion to social media, to their phones and these little wolves in their pockets. But you talk about the kind of flip side of that as being discipleship and gaining digital autonomy. Firstly, what do you mean by digital autonomy, individual digital autonomy? And secondly, how can we help disciple people to discern well, to post well, to kind of be a positive influence on social media if this is not a neutral tool, it's a tool meant for negative discourse?
Yeah. The what's funny, I'm contracted to write a second book that I'm in the middle of writing. That will come out with Moody Publishers in 2023, probably February 2023, so like a year after terms is coming out here in February. And this second book is straight at this question, which is the book is tentatively titled "The Wolf in Your Pocket," which I don't know if it'll stick or not. Drew, my buddy Drew, my editor, and I will have to discuss it. I was like, I just need to title this file something, so let's just come up with something. But we might need to make it something a bit more clear because it can be kind of ambiguous. But yeah, like the whole point. Yeah, the whole, like, to your point about how like people changing throughout and the pandemic. I mean, I've talked to a handful of pastors, a good number. I want to say between 1 and 2 dozen pastors in the last 6 months. Just asking them, like, how do you see social media impacting your churches? And their answers are largely negative. I'm sure you can guess. Now, they have said it's been helpful for them to stay connected during lockdown periods or whatever. So they're not saying it's all doom and gloom. However, they most of them have said things like, man, this guy, Jim never used to be a jerk, but now, man, he's just coming at me about all kinds of stuff. And it's like the conflict culture that thrives on the internet is almost really starting to spill over into a lot of churches. Not that there hasn't been conflict in churches, but pastors that I've spoken with have said it's at a much higher clip than it's ever been before. And so individual digital autonomy, I think what I generally mean by that is, not being enslaved to your social media platform of choice, really your phones generally, but and really being able to detach yourself, kind of zoom out idea that I've communicated of like, how is this affecting me? Let's like detach myself. Let's not be ruled by these platforms. A big message of Terms coming out in February is that these tools were created to serve us, but we've really come to serve these tools. And we've really come to be enslaved in a lot of ways to these tools, even though they were ostensibly created to help make our lives easier. They've made our lives harder in a lot of ways. And so I really think kind of, separating ourselves from that and gaining some independence from those platforms and not having dependence on them is really important. And I think, to answer the second part of your question on discipling amid this, that's what the entire next book is about. So I can't, it would take me we could have we will probably one day have an entire podcast about this exact question because there's so much. But generally what I would say is pastors are really grappling with the fact that their influence and authority among their people is at an all-time low. I've heard this a lot from pastors in the past about like people come and listen to me preach on a Sunday for an hour, and maybe they go to small group for an hour during the week, but then they're watching cable news 6 hours a day throughout the week. How could I ever compete with that influence? The same thing is true with social media, just it's way more frequent and many more people are enslaved by social media than are enslaved by cable news these days, is how I would put it. So it's a much more prevalent problem, but it's a similar one to what I heard a lot of pastors reckoning with back in the early 2000s when cable news really started to explode. And so what I would say is the general advice or like bit that really is woven through that whole next book is it's a long-term time in process for a pastor, for church leaders, for really anyone who's in charge of discipling other people, whether it's even a parent. You're not going to solve a discipleship crisis caused by social media with a sermon series about why social media is bad. You're not going to solve, like, social media is warping our understanding of community and friendship, I think. And you're not going to solve that problem as a pastor with a sermon series on community. I think the way you solve a lot of the problems, spiritual problems that pastors are seeing in churches that I think are directly attributable to our relationship with the social internet, at least in large part, anxiety, a warped understanding of beauty and sexuality, misunderstanding of what like a over prioritization of entertainment, which we've already talked about a little bit, but like pastors feel like the need to be entertainers more than they ever have. And that's because people have been amusing themselves to death. And so I think the solution to a lot of those problems, if I could like blanket give one solution, is long haul, person to person, boots on the ground discipleship practices, like meeting with people for coffee regularly, reading your Bible regularly, like just really things that are not like revolutionary or new. But I think what a lot of pastors sometimes misunderstand is that they think that they can solve a problem like this with like content, with preaching, and look, I'm not going to say the Holy Spirit can't do things like that. All of that stuff is very important. But I think you generally advise not to fight fire with fire. But I think when it comes to wrestling people's souls away from the social internet, the fire is time. That's the reason their souls are bound up in the social internet to begin with, because people are spending roughly 2.5 hours a day on social media on average. You have to fight time with time. Like the only way a pastor or a church leader is going to wrestle their parishioners' souls away from the social internet is by spending a lot more time with them than 2 hours a week. I think that's the only answer.
Yeah, and even on the the kind of topic of preaching, even when something hits a congregant from the sermon, I'll get people come up to me after our pastor has preached, and they'll come and they'll say, this thing really affected me, this thing really hit me, I'm really struggling with this, could we go through this, could we talk about this, have you got 10 minutes, an hour after the service to talk about this thing? It rarely occurs that they're like, oh great, I was convicted by it, I'm now changed. In every sphere of life, they're going, I'm convicted by this, now I need to go to somebody who can help me be sanctified, be changed by the Holy Spirit, because God works through community, God works through church.
Right. Yeah, and I think the like a sermon series like on like if you're like, man, my people are just like making friends online all the time, they're not spending time in person, a sermon series on community, which I kind of just like jokingly dismissed it, that can be great kindling to get the fire going. Like I think that it can really, like doing a sermon series on whatever issue you see arising in your church because maybe of the social internet's impact, I think that's a great starting point, launching point for exactly the reason you just described. It kind of brings to the fore, hey, this is a problem, and then it must be followed by significant time in community and spending time talking with one another. And you just really, no one, even with a message as powerful as the gospel, I don't think that 2 hours a week will ever compete with 2.5 hours a day. I just like, you need to be spent like encouraging people. And I'm not saying like pastors need to spend time with everybody. It's, you need to encourage people within your church to be spending time with each other. And, that's just one example, but yeah, I think what you said is a really good point.
Yeah, I agree with you. Just having that environment of discipleship in a church. I think both of us are really passionate about that, about seeing disciples. Like Jesus's last command was go and make disciples. I think that's so good. And I pick up a little bit about what you said nearer not the beginning, what you said before. About, I was really struck. So when you talked about the wolves in our pockets, sorry, I know this is going back a little bit. It reminded me of just what the Bible says about false teaching and how literally easy it is, the access to actually get stuff. I looked on Spotify a few weeks ago just to find some more podcasts, because I also love podcasts. And when you just go on Spotify and like you look at the different genres and categories for the religion, spirituality, the only Christian podcast that they recommended was a Joel Osteen one. I was like, oh man, it's so important.
Are we including that as Christian podcast? You heard it here first, guys. Controversy.
But yeah, just I guess the importance of teaching discernment and discipling people in discerning what's good. And you said about Christians should inspire to be the people least susceptible to spreading falsehood, and most prone to sharing truth, even if that truth is boring and get less clicks, about having reality over sensationalism. I honestly absolutely loved that. I thought it was so great how like Paul encourages and lifts up the
Bavarians. Anna always calls them the Bavarians because of cheese, because she's remembering it as Bereans. Brie.
I just love cheese so much.
Every single time she's like, it's the Bavarians. I'm like, they didn't exist for another 1,000 years. Like it's but yeah, sorry.
We're gonna call them Bavarians.
That's wonderful.
It's Paul and the Bavarians.
But yeah, how he says how great they are because they check everything against the Bible. And I loved about how you were talking about how it's so true. Social media absolutely thrives over sensationalism. And one person can say one thing out of context and it absolutely blows up. And actually how I've been thinking about the nativity as well, because I don't know when this episode's coming out, but it's
January, because it's January 2022 right now.
Well,
is it?
It is, yeah. Wonderful, isn't it?
Well, Christmas has already come and it's been great.
It's been wonderful.
Wonderful.
But yeah, like the nativity, like you do it all the time in school, and it's such a thing that actually a lot of people, I was talking to some work colleagues, and they were just treating it as like boring because it happens all the time. And actually it's so like, just even if the truth feels boring, actually it's a beautiful and an incredible truth that Jesus humbles himself and comes down the sun, and yet it doesn't have the same clicks. That was a bit of a ramble. There wasn't necessarily a question.
It's fine. I think that's a wonderful,
no, I get it.
A wonderful point to end on. You've said share what's true, even if it's boring. That was the header for what Anna just read out, and I think that's a really good thing to do. Something that we'd really encourage everyone to do, even if it's just something today that you're like, I've read this thing. Some people are going to find it boring, but it's right.
I've got one last question to finish us off.
Sure.
What would you say, what hope do you have for us? On a positive note, God's sovereign, and he can use the bad things and the things that have been made to be corrupted, and actually he can bring great good news. Yeah. So what can we do for,
I think the hope I have to share is that social media isn't all bad. I think we've talked a lot about the negative effects, the negative bents of social media, and I think with good reason, because the reason it's important to talk about those things explicitly is because it's easy for us to just adopt new technologies or forms of media because they scratch an itch we have. They make us entertained or feel good, and we don't question them the way we should. So I do think this conversation we've had that might feel sad or discouraging, we don't have those kinds of conversations enough. So I think it's sometimes important to have those. However, if you're listening to this podcast episode, you may think that like I hate social media and think it's all bad. I don't. I'm on it for a reason. Like if I thought it was all bad and completely unredemptive, but I still maintained all the social media presence that I do, I would be a hypocrite. Because I don't think it's all bad. I just think that a blind embrace of it is bad, and that we should be a little bit more caught. Like we should treat social media the way we would treat a new acquaintance that we don't totally trust. Like maybe you don't let them babysit your kids, but you and I suppose that could be more literal.
That's good. I was going to say that's quite literal.
But you don't, you wouldn't invite this new social media stranger into your home for dinner necessarily, but you might have a nice conversation with them on your front porch or something like that. So I think we should have a more careful relationship. But I think the word of hope I would have is, without social media, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Yay!
This is true.
And I think there are so many fun relationships and friendships that for me have been initiated on social media. And depending on geographical context, may still live 50%, 80% on social media. But once or twice a year when I go off to a conference or visit a city, I'll be able to get coffee with a friend that I first met on Twitter or something like that. And I think that's really sweet. I think that's really rich. Again, I always start thinking about like, well, what do we need to be careful of? We need to be careful of like that those relationships don't trump our in-person relationships. But I do think that it's important for us to recognize that there is value here, that the connection that you guys and I get to make here, it's been so fun getting to hang out and talk with you. I wish I could hop on a plane and come over to Brighton and visit you guys. It'd be so fun.
Oh, it'd be so great.
Or you guys vice versa. Like I love that the internet, the social internet has brought people like us together in ways that we simply would have never really had the means to previously. And I think that's really cool. That's what keeps bringing me back is I get to meet so many fascinating people and interact with so many fascinating people and see how God is working through so many great people all around the world in ways that I simply never would have before. And so I think if we put some guardrails, if we have a sober mind about social media and treat it with a measure of caution, rather than just some new app comes out and you just wholly embrace it and use it with reckless abandon. I think if we just exercise a measure of care and know that there are greater factors at play, like them trying to make a profit or harvesting our data or things like that. If we keep those things in our mind and try to engage wisely, it can be very good. And so I think that would be my message of hope, is it's not all bad. I just think that we should probably act with a little bit more intentionality than we have historically with these platforms. And I think when you do that, great, beautiful images of the kingdom of God and our futures together in eternity can be seen in conversations like this.
That's really, really excellent. Thank you so much. Talking about positive influence on platforms and social media, people can go find you at Terms of Service, which is your newsletter, which I've really enjoyed. Even during this episode, your newsletter on Pokemon and nostalgia has come through my inbox. But it's also in your new book. People can go and pre-order that now. That's coming out next month, presumably everywhere normal books are sold. We're really looking forward to it. We're definitely going to go pick that up.
And where else can we find you on social media?
Yeah, the primary platform I use is Twitter. I'm at Chris Martin 17, not to be confused with the Coldplay singer, which is the most common. Yeah. Well, I mean, nobody's seen us in the same room, so
this is true.
You don't know. But except the people who were at the 2009 Viva concert in Indianapolis, Indiana, we were in the same room at that point. At Chris Martin 17 on Twitter is my primary, where I engage with strangers, I guess you could say. I have an Instagram, but I don't really, my life's not interesting enough in pictures to be posting a whole lot there. So I'm not super, I'm not, it's the same handle on Instagram at Chris Martin 17, but I'm not super active there. But yeah, Twitter's the best place to reach me, and then the news, you can find the newsletter and a link there and such. So yeah.
Wonderful. Oh, mate, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been great chatting to you.
We've really enjoyed this. Thank you so much. We're looking forward to chatting to you again once Wolves in Our Pockets, or whatever it ends up being called, is out. Thank you so much, and we'll chat to you soon.